We do live in a world of broken and fallen people who, regardless of the evidence, they will avoid the evidence to find the excuse. They will avoid the evidence of what's true to find the excuse so they can reject God. Last time we were dealing with this before Passion Week, there was this moment that happened in chapter 6, all the way through the first 2 verses of chapter 7. And Elisha is living in the land of Israel. There is a famine happening in the land. It's one that he predicted would happen. And really the reason that the famine is going on is the army of Syria has been attacking and harassing the nation of Israel. They've been really going at it. And they tried to make the war go quicker. The Syrian army tried to attack Israel and make the war go quicker by sending raiders into the land of Israel. But every single time they would try to raid a town and take out a piece of the land of Israel, Elisha had a vision and told the king of Israel where to send the army, and he stopped them in their tracks every single time. And so the king got really annoyed with that. The king of Syria got sick of losing all of these battles, not understanding why he wasn't able to make this war go quicker. Every time they tried to, get over the walls of Israel and over the walls of the city of Samaria, as they're trying to attack and shorten the war and make it quicker, they get stopped at every turn. And he finds out that the reason is Elisha. So he comes up with this brilliant plan, which you'll know what I mean in a second. His brilliant plan is this guy who seems to be a prophet from God and has supernatural ability to know every move I'm going to make. This is my plan. I'm going to send a large battalion from my army to just go kill Elisha. And if we get rid of Elisha, we get rid of the problem. Except there's one massive flaw in that plan, which is the supernatural ability of Elisha to know what's going to happen before it happens because of the visions from God. So when he sends this battalion after Elisha, they lose. As the army is coming in to kill Elisha, to capture him, Elisha's servant looks at Elisha scared, and Elisha says, "Don't worry about it." And he actually prays and opens the eyes of his servant. And his servant actually sees God's army that's protecting Elisha. Elisha is bigger than the invading force coming to kill him. And so he now understands the calm and comfort of Elisha. Then Elisha prays over the invading force, and they get blinded. And then Elisha himself leads the invading force because they ask him, as they're blinded, if they can take him to Elisha, which is really funny. They've been this force coming to kill Elisha, and then they run into him blinded and say, "Hey, stranger, could you take us to Elisha the prophet?" And Elisha the prophet is the one who answers and says, "Come along." And he takes them directly to the king of Israel. And then, when he opens their eyes in front of the king of Israel asks Elisha if they should just slaughter them. And Elisha says, "No, don't do that. Let's feed them." And he gives them a feast, and then they run back to Syria. Well, the result of that is that Elisha is still alive. An entire battalion of the army has found out that they can't take on Elisha, and the king of Syria has heard that news, and that only strengthens his resolve to finish the war, but take a different route, to choose a different strategy. So what he decides is he's no longer going to try to shorten the war. He's not going to take the short game. He's going to play the long game. And the reason is Elisha. He knows he can't send invading forces to get small skirmish victories to make the war last shorter. So he decides he's just going to have his invading force outside the walls of Samaria, and he's just going to starve the people out and create a blockade, basically, so that their resources cannot get in. And that is really the reason for the famine. And so Elisha, who has protected these people every step of the way in these small skirmishes, has now become the object of scorn for the king of Syria. But also, the king of Israel is blaming Elisha for the famine and all of the difficulty that they're dealing with, because the strategy of the king of Syria has put this famine on because Elisha has been so successful at helping everybody, which is a weird thing to be mad about. But because it's caused this famine, he blames Elisha, instead of looking introspectively and saying that maybe this entire judgment is coming on behalf of us and the king specifically, who's leading a culture that is in opposition to God. And even though the prophet continually tells you what the right things are to do and tries to correct your moral trajectory and get your heart back on fire for the Lord, they refuse to listen. Well, it ends up at the end of what we talked about a few weeks ago. There was an officer who heard Elisha reply to this whole tragedy. This famine that's been going on, people are dying of starvation inside of Israel. The Syrian army has surrounded the walls. Everything looks bleak and glim, and everyone's looking at Elisha and blaming him. And Elisha responds and says, listen, I'm going to tell you, tomorrow, everything is going to be different. All of the complaints you have now, where you're buying low quality food at insane prices and just trying to survive, tomorrow you're going to find good quality food extremely cheap because the famine will be over tomorrow. And God has spoken through his prophet. Well, one of the officers who heard this actually said, look, if Elisha, if the Lord could make windows in heaven, how could this thing be? Meaning, even if Elisha was able to open up the sky and allow heaven to rain down on Israel, they couldn't solve the problems. That was his response to Elisha's message. And Elisha says, this thing is guaranteed, and you're going to see it happen, to this officer who replied to him, but you won't get to partake. And that's where we left off. And that was the conversation that's leading to what we're talking about tonight. And the idea is God has spoken and he's made a promise. We get to see what happens to those who were faithful enough to persevere and to the person who rejected that promise. So let's go ahead and look, starting in verse 3. Now, there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate. This is to the city of Samaria. And they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we'll die also. Now therefore, come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, they'll live. And if they kill us, we shall only die. So there's some lepers sitting outside the city, 4 of them. And they're not allowed in the city because of their wicked disease. However, at this point, because the city's in a famine and everyone's dying anyway, they're contemplating their options. They're outside the city, so they're not protected by the walls. So they could die. They could die of their disease. They could die from the war. There's lots of things that could go wrong. And they say, well, let's weigh our options. What if we go into the city? Well, if we go into the city, we're just going to suffer the same effects. The famine exists in the city. We still have our disease, so we're just going to die. If we stay here, we're just going to die. So what if we go and surrender to the Syrians? If we do that, perhaps they'll feed us and we'll live. And if they kill us, we were going to die anyway. This seems to be our best bet, our only option. So some very pragmatic guys who are dealing with a difficult disease decide they're going to go surrender to the Syrians. Well, they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians, and when they came to the outskirts of the Syrian camp. To their surprise, no one was there. Now that's an odd picture. These four guys, unclean, looking to find some sort of help, go to the enemy camp, and everything's there. All the tents are there, the equipment's there, the food is there, the plunder is there, but no human beings are there. That's a strange scene to walk into. I can't imagine what they were thinking immediately when that happened, but they go on this adventure, basically, to say, the Lord has caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. So they said to one another, the king of Israel hired against us the king of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us. So here's what happened. They walk into this empty camp, and it turns out that God himself made the enemy hear something that wasn't there. They heard such a massive army coming for them that they actually thought that the Israelites hired two other foreign powers to protect them, and they were about to lose a massive battle. So they hightail it out of there. In verse 7, it says, therefore they arose and fled at twilight and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, and their donkeys. And they fled for their lives. Now, if there's one way to get an army to walk away from all of the things that keep them alive, it's their life. That's the thing that they value the most. And they ran away, leaving all of their supplies, all of their camp, all of their animals and plunder, all there. So when the lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent, they ate and they drank, and carried from it silver and gold and clothing, and went and hid them. And then they came back and entered another tent and carried some from there also and went and hid it. Then they said to another, what we are doing is not right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now, therefore, come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they walk in on this enemy camp, and all of their starvation, all of their illness, everything they've been going through during this famine with leprosy, it hits them like a bullet between the eyes. And they go, we are taking advantage of this. There's bread, there's food, there's stuff to drink, and they go and they raid the camp. They even find some gold and silver. They take it for themselves, and they can't believe they just hit the jackpot. And then in the midst of all of their plundering and taking advantage of the situation, they remembered what was waiting back home. And they said, whoa, we got to stop. This is the conscience of humanity working inside of them. This is not okay. We can't do this. All of our brothers and sisters inside of Samaria are hiding in their homes, starving to death, waiting to die because they think the Syrian army is out here encamped waiting to kill them. They have no idea that God sent them packing away scared without anyone ever having to lift a bow. And we're enjoying all of the spoils of it. We're leaving everybody else to starve. We've got to go tell the king. We got to let somebody know. This is actually good news, and we can be the heroes of our people rather than just selfish people who are taking for ourselves. So they went and they called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, we went to the Syrian camp, and surprisingly, no one was there, not a human sound, only horses and donkeys tied and the tents intact. And the gatekeepers called out, and they told it to the king's household inside. Now the king arose in the night and said to his servants, let me tell you now what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we're hungry. Therefore, they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city. So the these lepers, they go, they tell the king, and they say, look, we got good news. We went to the Syrian camp. We actually had some food and drink for ourselves. This is great. No one's there, not a peep, not a sound. But interestingly, all of their stuff is there. Their horses, the donkeys, the camp, the tents. We get to keep it all. Like, this is incredible news. There's food. We've all been starving. We have all the supplies we need to feed the people inside the city. This is great news. And the king hears this news and he goes, this sounds like a trap. And all I see is Admiral Akbar in my head from Star Wars. It's a trap. You know what I'm talking about? That's the only picture in my mind. That's what he says. No, they're waiting for us to go. They watched you. If we go out there, they're going to pop out of the woods and they're going to take us down. This is guerrilla warfare, apparently. But one of his servants answered and said, please let several men take 5 of the remaining horses which are left in the city. Look, they may either become like all the multitude of Israel that are left in it, or indeed, I say, they may become like all the multitude of Israel left from those who are consumed. Let us send them and see. And so someone with some sense talks to the king and says, look, it's dire. We have no hope right now. There's a famine in the city. People are starving. They've resorted to cannibalism. It's that bad. What harm would it do to send a battalion out to see? If they get raided, they're no better off than if they stay here because everybody's dying. We got to see if there's a glimmer of hope, we got to take it. Now, remember, this is all on the heels of Elisha making a promise that everything would be okay. That, in fact, the famine would end at the time that they're experiencing right now. And so you're looking at all of the people who are doubting. Can God really be good? If we've experienced difficulty, can God still be good? Yes, he can. Life is difficult, but Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things, God works together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Those who love him and are called and are fulfilling the purpose God has given them, he will work all things together for their good. It doesn't say they will only experience good things. But whatever you experience in this life, whatever difficulty you go through, God can work together for the good. So they go. Therefore, they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them in the direction of the Syrian army, saying, go and see. Go and see. I love that. You know, there might be some doubts. There might be some apprehension or hesitation. But check it out. Does Jesus say, seek and you will find? Go and find out. If God has promised something and you go and see if that promise has come true, you're going to end up on the right side of the eyeballs because you're going to actually see that God keeps his promises. So he says, go and see. They went after them in the Jordan, and indeed all the road was full of garments and weapons, which the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned and told the king. And then the people went out and plundered the tents of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. So exactly what Elisha promised happened. They go out in there and they find out that the lepers were not lying, and they weren't deceived either. The camp was completely abandoned by the Syrians, and they left all of the supplies for all of their army and all of their goods. And so Israel freely wins a battle without ever having to lift a sword or an arrow. And in doing so, they get to plunder and take back everything from the camp. All of the fabrics and materials for the tents, all of the livestock and the horses and the donkeys, all of the weapons that were left behind, as well as all of the food that was there to feed an army that was looking to play the long game and starve out an entire city for as long as it took, which means there was a whole lot of food in the army camp. And they bring it back, and in one day, even though they haven't been able to grow food for themselves or get food for themselves for months or years, or however long this siege has lasted, they get so much food that now supply and demand has completely flipped on its head. And there is a massive supply so big that an entire city of starving people can't buy it all, no matter how cheap it is. And it ends up being good quality food at really cheap prices. I don't know if there's a grocery store that has that slogan, but the Syrian army gave that one to the Israelites. Really good quality food for low, low, low prices. Thank you, Samaria. Now the king the king had appointed the officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled him in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God said, who had spoken when the king came down to him. So it happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel shall be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. So the one guy who spoke up when God made a promise and said, that will never happen, his fate was sealed. And Elisha said, listen, tomorrow you're going to see God's promise come true, but you won't get to participate in it. And as he's guarding the gate and people finally have access to the food they've been dying for, they rush the city gate and he ends up getting trampled underfoot. And so he witnesses the miracle and doesn't get to participate, just like Elisha said. Now, you see a few different avenues here. Elisha clearly knew what was going to happen. He had full faith that God's promises would come true. And when he said, thus said the Lord, he meant it. And he knew that promise would come true. Now the people, they heard this, but they had doubts. But enough hope and enough insight to say, let's go and see if what God said happened. And they did. And they received the blessing. So if you're having doubts, if you're wondering, if you're worrying about or having anxiety about your faith, go and see. Seek and you'll find. There are answers out there for you to help you with the struggles. God's promises are true, God is real, and he is there for you. But for those who would reject God regardless of all of the evidence that they see. Now this guy, who was serving under the king, had seen Elisha over and over make statements and promises and do miraculous things. He had witnessed Elisha know exactly where the Syrian army was every time they tried to invade a town. And miraculously, that town would be saved. He knows about Elisha healing Naaman from the Syrian army. He knows about Elisha raising people from the dead, healing people from sickness. He knows about Elisha healing the poison pot that almost killed the sons of the prophets. Like, people know what Elisha's doing. They know everything that he's done. And when he makes a promise, he hasn't been wrong yet. But regardless of all the evidence in front of this guy's eyes and everything he's seen Elisha proclaim and come true, he said, no way. Now, sometimes that's true. We do live in a world of broken and fallen people who, regardless of the evidence, they will avoid the evidence to find the excuse. They will avoid the evidence of what's true to find the excuse so they can reject God. Why? I don't know. I do know that we're broken, and we're, as human beings, sometimes we just don't want to be held accountable. And maybe that's it. But this guy rejected, regardless of all the evidence in front of his face. And his fate was sealed exactly as God had said. Now, that's true for all of us. All of our fates are sealed to the way that God has set it. If we trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, if we trust in his sacrifice and his resurrection, then we'll be saved. That's promised to us. If you confess with your mouth that Christ is Lord and believe in your heart that he was raised from the dead, you will be saved. We're promised that. For whosoever believes will be saved. We know this. That's what's promised to us. However, it's also promised in that same section of John 3 that those who choose not to believe are condemned already. Because if you are just going to reject the evidence, ignore the evidence for the sake of your excuse, then your fate is sealed. And God is not going to override your desire if you choose to reject him. And that's what happened to this officer. He gets trampled at the gate. And he saw the miracle right before it happened. Now, the only thing that freaks me out, because I think about that moment. There will be a time for every person ever who will stand before the throne of God. And you will get to see, in stark contrast to whatever fantasy was inside your head, what is real. And what holiness and righteousness and perfection actually looks like. And we will all get to see how far from the holiness of God we truly are. And every single one of us will realize how much debt Jesus paid on the cross. And not all of us will be thankful that we've received it. The way that Jesus puts it when he talks about those who face judgment is that they'll be cast into Gehenna, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's interesting. And I think R.C. Sproul maybe gives the best illustration of what that means and what that looks like. And he says it this way, that there's two responses to being wrong and experiencing the judgment of God. That's weeping or gnashing of teeth. Meaning, that reality either causes you to weep for eternity because you realized how wrong you were and how holy and good God was. Or, in your continued sin, you continue to shake your fist at God and grit your teeth in your own judgment. And R.C. Sproul put it this way. He said, if by any stretch of the imagination I'm wrong and I was cast into the pit, I can tell you, I'll be one who's weeping, because I understand wholeheartedly that I deserve judgment if God gives it to me. There's no gnashing of teeth or shaking my fist at God. It would only be weeping at me not getting it right. The good news is we have the recorded words of Jesus and his apostles, so we don't have to get it wrong. Jesus said, for God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. Paul echoes that response by saying, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is raised from the dead, you will be saved. It's about faith. If you put your faith and trust in what Christ did on the cross and receive new life from the resurrection, you don't have to worry about weeping or gnashing of teeth. Don't suffer the evidence for an excuse. Goes on to say, that officer answered the man of God, saying, Now look, the Lord would make windows in heaven. How could such a thing be? And he said, in fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. Because there's only one thing that happens when you reject God. When you are separate from God, that can only be described as death. When you're separated from all that is good, all that is holy, all that is righteous, all that is mercy and compassion, when you reject it and you separate yourself from it, that is death. And that's what he received. And that's what's on the table for everyone who needs to make a decision with what they're going to do with Jesus. The cross was for you, and the resurrection can give you new life. All you have to do is put your trust and faith in it and receive it. Not just believe that, but believe in. There are a lot of people in this world that know that that's true, or at least believe that story, or have some inkling that that story is real. But they haven't put their faith and trust in it. They haven't followed Christ. The illustration that I've often used for this, that I think is an easy way to make it understandable, is you can believe that a chair will support your weight, but you haven't trusted in that until you sit in it. You can believe that the story of the cross and the resurrection is true, but it has no effect unless you put your faith in it. Not just believe that, but believe in. And you live for it. And while it's not an easy story to tell, there are two sides of it. One is the rejection of God leads to death. But the other side of the coin is heavily optimistic, which is when God makes a promise, he's guaranteed to keep it. Elisha promised that the famine would end and that tomorrow everything would be all right. The famine did end. The difficulty did end. And for all of us who are wondering about the difficulties of life and the things that we have to deal with, that's true to us too. The difficulty will end. Now, it may end in an earthly fashion. You might be able to persevere through a difficulty and on the other side of it receive some sort of blessing that helps you here and now. But even if that doesn't happen, you can have the faith of those like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who said, even if our God doesn't save us, we'll never bow to the world. Because on the other side of it, there's an eternity waiting that is eternally blissful. And so the difficulty does have an expiration date. And I'd rather spend my time before that expiration date goes through sending out the eviction notice of all of God's enemies in the spiritual realm and winning the battle for Christ to make the church what he's always expected it to be, to bring in the fullness of the Gentiles, to expand the gospel and evangelize, and to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I hope that you'll join me in that desire and task. Let's pray.